Good evening. I'm so pleased to be with all of you and my panel colleagues. We're all here this evening to support the U.S. China Policy Foundation in its efforts to forge the basis of understanding between the United States and China that will make a more peaceful world possible. We're here to support also Wang Ji and Ernestine in their decades-long efforts in this regard. And in this respect, I also want to thank Ariane Rosen for her exertions on behalf of us all and for putting together this evening's panel. There are many topics that need to be addressed this evening, and I know they will be. But a core observation is that both Beijing and Washington are pursuing policies not in their own long-term interests. Instead, both are pursuing policies that easily could produce high levels of conflict, possibly war. This would be a war initially conceived to be short, decisive, and contained by both sides, but it almost certainly would end up protracted, escalating, and quite possibly employing weapons of mass destruction. No one in world history has experienced conducting conflict between two nuclear powers, each of which is also armed with cyber means to disrupt basic social functions and each other's entire populations. This would unfold in a globalized economy of interconnected supply chains. And we can see a future in which artificial intelligence equations make decisions rather than people. A principal purpose of this evening's program is to search for constructive paths forward for the United States and China. But sometimes driving forward requires occasional glances into the rearview mirror. Many of you here this evening will remember former government official and later prominent academic expert on Chinese foreign policy, Alan Whiting. He was at the universities of Michigan and later Arizona in his post-government career. And I was fortunate enough to have an office across the hall from him at the University of Michigan in the mid-1970s. Alan had already written his classic book, China Crosses the Yalu, essentially the story of how the United States and China stumbled into the Korean War in late 1950. The basic story was that the United States underestimated Chinese power, underestimated the sense of threat that the Chinese felt. The Truman administration also thought that Beijing would believe President Truman's soothing assurances about not threatening Beijing, rather than believing General MacArthur's hostile rhetoric and the general's attempts to use Taiwan in his struggle to roll back communism on the mainland. The Chinese did not think as Washington had imagined. Instead, Beijing acted on its fears, not its hopes. War broke out, and before long, the U.S. began its longest retreat in its military history. Only 3 years later, in mid-1953, did the conflict suspend along approximately the same line it had begun on. There were more than 35,000 U.S. combat deaths. Whiting spent much of the rest of his academic and policy life cautioning how difficult it was to achieve effective deterrence and warning against pushing Beijing too far, especially on sensitive issues like its borders and Taiwan. In 1950, we managed to push both of those buttons in Beijing simultaneously, threatening China's borders and mobilizing Taiwan in our struggle against the PRC. Frankly, while no historical analogy is perfect, I see some of the same dynamics at work today. When I hear the U.S. administration speak on these topics, I do not hear or see the kind of caution that I think historical experience demands. Over the Cold War with China, Whiting's warnings were variously observed and ignored. Some thought he was overly alarmist. When his counsel was ignored in terms of the Vietnam intervention, we ended up facing 350,000 PRC troops in Vietnam, in North Vietnam, not to mention the regular North Vietnamese army itself backed by Beijing. When Whiting's warnings were observed, as Robert McNamara did in prosecuting the air war against North Vietnam, we avoided a wider conflict with China. When Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger acted in alignment with the idea of reducing threat along China's borders and right-sizing our commitments to Taiwan, we had almost 50 years of peace. Today, both sides are making huge mistakes in terms of their internal governance by unleashing domestic forces of conflict and nationalism that will be hard to stuff back into the bottle. These forces make effective deterrence, crisis control, and de-escalation more difficult to achieve. With increasing military exercises by both sides and an arms race, the chances of accident and miscalculation are growing. The basic approach both sides need to adopt includes the following elements. First, there was some good news out of the mid-November Xi-Biden summit. For the first time, the Chinese dangled some limited interest in discussing arms control or strategic stabilization talks. The fact is that our crisis communications and crisis control mechanisms are wholly inadequate. Our management systems in the depths of the Cold War with Moscow were more developed. Second, to manage this relationship safely, we need not only deterrence, but we need positive incentives to hold things together. Not moving ahead on reducing tariffs at the same time that everybody is fearful of inflation and slowing growth is just quite simply nuts. And finally, that the United States and China are not cooperating in management of the global pandemic is egregious, especially given our record of fruitful cooperation in past pandemics. Finding ways to restart travel with vaccine recognitions would be just a first step. In short, if we're going to manage our way out of this dangerous tangle, we need to first recognize the peril we are in. Taiwan is the core danger, and the current administration has weakened its credible commitment to the One China policy. We should work on arms control. We should move ahead in improving economic relations by reducing tariffs and getting back to at least the phase one trade framework. And above all, do not turn this into a global ideological struggle between authoritarianism and democracy, about which there can be no compromise. Summits of democracy may be more of a problem than a solution. The Chinese, too, are making serious mistakes underestimating American resilience and overestimating their own capacity to control escalation. In light of all this, in the work of the U.S. China Policy Foundation assumes particular importance at this moment. I hope that each of us will do our utmost to strengthen its important work. And thank you very much.